Okay, so now we're going to turn to the Brazil Economic and Political Outlook panel. It's moderated by Paulo Vieira da Cunha and Drauzio Giacomelli.
As Carlos said, there has been particular progress in Brazil on the policy front, particularly on the regulatory area. This is often overlooked, and the progress in the privatization program continues. So that is really a welcome sight. But what hasn't happened, as he acknowledged, is the deeper reforms. So the question that always comes to mind is, if you have some micro progress, and of course, São Paulo is a booming entrepreneurial global center, if you have progress on the micro front, without the macro support, without the bigger reforms, can you really achieve sustainable higher growth? Without the tax reform that Carlos Costa said, for example, that has been on the table in the Congress in Brazil for nearly 40 years now. Can you really move forward with that? And those are nagging questions that really put the focus on what's happening in the short run and what can be achieved in the short run.
No, perfect. Thank you very much, Paulo, for the invitation. Everyone at Brazil and Cham, and everyone that is listening. And I think that's the first thing when we talk about inflation, and John already touched in some of these points, but we have to recognize it is a global phenomenon that was driven, and at least initially, mainly by an enormous amount of shock in the last couple of years that disrupted supply chains and also boosted demand, especially for goods when people were not allowed to consume services during the peak of the pandemic. And that's the inflationary process from the shocks gained traction on the back of all the policy stimuli around the globe, especially since 2020, all the fiscal, monetary policy, liquidities, and so on. So, and that's why JP Morgan economists, we do expect global inflation to reach at 6.5% by the end of the second quarter this year. These are levels that we haven't seen for a long time. If you take just one look, March, and John just touched about that, but March global CPI on average, our estimation was about 1.2%. This is the highest number in record. I think that since World War II, and when we actually had some data, some countries we don't even have data back that long. But yet, Brazil is a notch higher than that. Inflation now at 11.3%, double digits since September last year. And despite the fact that Brazil Central Bank has already started to hike rates in a very aggressive mode, even for our own standards. And total rate hikes since March last year, 925 bips. Central Bank already anticipated another 100 bip in May. We do expect an additional final 50 bips hike in June to end the cycle at 13.75%. Going forward, the message that I think is important is that we are close to the end of the tightening cycle. Fine-tuning with the last 50 bips that we believe, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, but I think that's it's fair balance now. And what it's important that all the monetary policy tighten, coupled with the impact of the war and the policy uncertainties domestically and abroad, should drive Brazil into a recession in the second half of the year. This is a policy-driven recession. This is a necessary inflation recession, actually, to help to disinflate the economy. And the lower demand, we do expect to see a sharp disinflation next year. Not yet to the midpoint of the target, but a significant disinflation from the 11.3% that we have now to 7.6% at the end of the year, and something around 4.2% at the end of next year. And And then I think that this disinflation with rates, nominal rates at 13.75, pending, of course, on what Chris is going to tell us that is going to happen with economic policy decisions in the next governments, should allow the central bank to engage in an easing cycle much sooner than other central banks that would still be normalizing their interest rates already at the end of the first quarter next year or beginning the second quarter. I think that we should start to see an easing cycle here.
Hi, hello everyone. Thank you, Paulo, and I would like to thank the Brazilian Chamber for the invitation as well. The shorter term, when we look at growth, ended up looking a little bit more positive, and I say a little bit more positive vis-a-vis what consensus had. If you recall, at the end of last year, some houses were forecasting negative growth, and at the end of the day, what happened with the geopolitical conflict is that with the much higher than expected commodity prices, terms of trade, and everything, it ended up benefiting a lot the agricultural sector for Brazil. So all those more negative growth expectations for this year ended up starting to move towards the positive camp. And I would say that we could even see consensus reach close to 1% for this year. And then for 2023, we're a little bit less constructive. We've got a growth forecast of 1.1% with negative risks. Again, we think that Brazil, with an interest rate at double digits, close to 13%, it's going to be very limiting on the ability for Brazil to grow much more than 1% for next year. And then moving on to the inflationary scenario, as Cassiana said, I mean, the drivers here are clearly external. We have on the oil price, on the food price, we've got also some domestic drivers when it comes to food prices because of the bad weather that we've had in the south of the country, which is affecting crops. So all of this ended up boosting inflation much more than expected at the start of the year. And then I would say that although the expectation is for inflation to decelerate and decelerate more aggressively in the second half because of all the cumulative hikes, the question is, what about oil prices? When you look at the correlation between IPCA and oil prices is quite strong, especially after 2018. So the one thing that we hear investors say about getting a little bit more optimistic on inflation in Brazil is look at the peak of oil prices. When it's going to start coming down, then inflation in Brazil is most likely going to start coming down as well. The fiscal, I would say, has always been for the past maybe 10 to 8 years at the forefront of Brazil. And it happens that short-term fiscal looks better. I mean, we've heard in our visits to investors things like, oh, you know, we don't really want to talk about the fiscal. Let's talk about something else, about growth, about inflation, about rates. So what we are perceiving is that people are still concerned about the fiscal longer term, but in the short term, some factors are actually showing a much better starting point for the fiscal. So those factors have to do with cyclical factors that are improving a lot on the revenue side. So we know that fiscal revenues are very commodity intensive for Brazil. So when we look at revenues in terms of GDP, we are expecting revenues to be close to 22.7% of GDP this year. Just to give you an idea, in the past 10 years, revenues in terms of GDP has been barely above 22%. So it's quite a boost here, something that we've already seen last year. And then, of course, we've got the fact that we've got higher inflation, which is helping to inflate revenues as well. So in the short term, revenues are playing an important role in driving the positive fiscal surprises that we've been seeing in the past months, and also I would say throughout last year. So we assume that there's going to be some flexibilization of the spending cap. We believe that it's very restrictive and that beyond 2023, there's going to need to be some sort of adjustment there in the rule. We also expect that GDP for the long term approaches 2%, and also that real interest rates remains somewhat around 4% in real terms. So we are, I would say, constructive
in the long run.
Constructive at the long run. Our main concern here, I would say, it's not so much the 4% of real interest rates. I would say it's more about growth. It's about getting growth back up to 2%. Because as we've said, I mean, Brazil has done a lot of structural reforms. Can they be undone? Yes, they can, but they will take time. We don't believe that, you know, in 4 to 5 years, we can undo and go all the way back to the equilibrium that we used to have in Brazil 6 to 5 years ago.
Thank you, Paulo, and good morning, everyone. I think the truth is always somewhere in the middle, right? We do recognize both the challenges and the strengths in the rating and the credit profile of Brazil in general. So I will as you may know, we affirmed the rating at BA2 with a stable outlook just actually, I don't know, last week, and it takes account of many of these elements that both Cassiana and Anna discussed. So for us, I would say we have 4 key points, I would say, that shape the credit profile for Brazil, say, in the next 12 to 24 months. First is the track record of structural and fiscal reforms. And both prospects and track records are important. The reason is, as we heard, you know, throughout the webinar so far, there has been a lot of meaningful and structural reforms that were implemented, both on the macro, I mean, the fiscal side, the macro and monetary policy side, and the privatization push and all of that. So inflation globally has been an issue. Even before the military conflict in Ukraine, coming out of the COVID supply chain disruptions and very strong demand globally. So these elements are fading relative to now the supply disruption and the shock to food and fuel prices. But we do expect that the inflation will start come down. So that will allow monetary policy to normalize again in the opposite side, or to become more neutral, if you will. What does that mean for fiscal policy is the key for us. So over the last, say, 5 years, Brazil's interest burden, as we measure it, interest revenue, has been coming down very significantly. So if you look at the peak, it was around 30%, that ratio, interest payment to revenue in 2015. It has come down to less than 15% last year. That's a big change in the fiscal dynamics and also in the fiscal effort required to stabilize that burden. Of course, this very virtuous cycle is turning now because of the global and Brazil-related inflationary pressure. So that in a way is part of the baseline. It will add some fiscal pressures in the short run, especially this year and next year. But we never expected interest rates in Brazil to stay at 2%, right? So that's coming from a very low level. It's normal to have this reversal, if you will. So over the medium term, we do expect that ratio to remain slightly below or around 20% starting in 2024. It's still relatively high compared to peers, but it's manageable, I would say. It is something that we look at and has been on our radar. So this is a metric that we care about. But still, the growth performance, as you point out, where do we look, future or the past? And I think if we look at if you will, 10 years from 2016, 17 to 2026, going forward, you have growth on average growth based on the forecast at less than 1% or barely around 1%. That is very low for Brazil. It's very low for an emerging market. It is something that I would say, if I have to put a puzzle together, it's still the missing piece in Brazil's credit profile that is kind of pulling lower the credit profile a bit. I wouldn't say even more than the fiscal. I would say today even more than the fiscal side, because we discussed a lot the fiscal, and there are mitigating factors that we see even in the current high debt level that support. But the growth piece is still missing. And that, I think, is the biggest challenge for us right now.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Paulo, John, and Drauzio for the invitation to participate in this very distinguished panel with colleagues and with Cassiana, Anna, and Samara. Look, heading into this cycle, I think that there has been a prone of excessive overshooting on expectations. If you were to kind of have this kind of conversation back in October, November, there was a lot of excitement over the odds of a third-party candidate coming out on top. Those expectations have been fizzled, and there was overshooting on the optimism, and now there is kind of a view that the third-party candidates don't have much of a shot. Last year, there was still skepticism over Lula's favoritism. Then we pivoted to an equilibrium at the beginning of the year where a lot of market participants and pundits saw this election as a done deal. Lula will have a kind of a walk in the park and should win easily. And now what we're seeing, with a modest but sustained recovery of the president in the polls over the course of the first 3 months of the year, kind of view that maybe this is not a done deal, and clearly the enthusiasm in the Bolsonaro camp that the president can win re-election in the presidential palace. I would say that there's confidence that the president is probably headed towards a re-election in October. I do not think this election is a done deal, but Lula is a clear favorite. Right now, we have Lula at around 70% probability of taking this election, but I am fully of the view that this race will tighten. If you look at second round simulations, Lula leads by an average of about 15 percentage points from the president. That should narrow to about 6 to 7 points, or between 5 and 10 points in the course of the campaign. So if there's a view right now that Bolsonaro probably has a shot, I would say that view will exacerbate and deepen as we head into the campaign cycle. And probably we're going to head to an equilibrium where there's an overshooting of the expectations on the odds of the president winning. Why do I say that? When we look at kind of elections, what I like to do is to use multiple electoral forecasting tools. Big election misses usually occur when you only look at one set of indicators. And the two best indicators to focus on right now is not vote intentions, but is where are the government's approval ratings? That's the best heuristic and predictor of the odds of an incumbent winning re-election if you look at it from a comparative basis. And then you also have to focus on what is it that voters really care about, and identify which candidate is strongest on the main issue. In 85% of elections, the candidate who is strongest on the main issue wins. When you look at the president's approval ratings, he has, the second half of last year, he had an average approval rating on a binary scale of about 30%. The first 3 months of the year, he has recovered to about 35, 36%, depending upon the poll aggregator that you use. If you have a comparative data set of international elections, any president with about 35, 36% approval ratings would have a 40% chance of winning. Okay, so the red line for a president to kind of win is usually when you have at least 40% of approval ratings. Okay, so in this comparative metric, the president would have to grow about another 5 percentage points in approval ratings to be there, na boca do gol, whether you win, don't win. It doesn't guarantee you a victory. You look at kind of the U.S. presidential election. Trump had 42% approval ratings, and he lost by 4 percentage points to Biden in the general election. Why? Because the main issue that voters cared about in the U.S. election was COVID. Trump was weak on COVID. And so looking at the main issue that voters care about, right, that hurt him. When you look at the Brazil election right now, the data is very clear. The main concern of voters is the economy, it's jobs and income. Coming out of the pandemic and with the inflation hit, income dropped by close to 10% on a real basis last year. People are having a hard time making ends meet. And in comparison to 4 years ago, where corruption was probably the second most important issue, now it's a distant third or fourth, right? So the economic issues are preponderant over some of the other issues. That's a good picture for former President Lula, because Lula traditionally is a candidate strong on jobs and income, and his big liability, corruption, is less important this time around. And so when I hear kind of Cassiana talking or Ana talking, and when I hear that really what we're seeing in the first half of this year is a recovery of the president based, from my interpretation, curious to see if you guys agree, based on a partial recovery of income that was driven by the readjustment of the national minimum wage at the end of the year, that they have a 10% increase to the national minimum wage, kind of 13th salary at the end of the year, the natural adjustments of the formal labor market where employers usually give a correction for inflation at the beginning of the year, some government measures on pardoning of student debt, withdrawal of the workers' compensation fund. So there was a partial recovery of income that led the president to go from 30 to 35. But going forward, I don't see a sustained economic factors that will justify that. Not only with a headline statement that Cassiana said we expect a recession in the second half of the year, but even on the inflationary front, probably inflation will corrode gradually over the next 4 or 5 months the partial recovery of real income that we saw in Q1. And I would add the fact that the Russia-Ukraine crisis, adds insult to injury, because we may have seen the full increase in food and potentially fuel inflation maybe. And I think that there are two kind of headlines for expectations for Lula government. Number one, I do think that he will assume office and will make let's say, moderate overtures to avoid a financial crisis of confidence early in his administration. This is a candidate who clearly will promise a lot more spending over the course of the campaign. This is Brazil's kind of social scar tissues coming out of the pandemic are significant, particularly with it on inflation. So there will be a debate to put a constitutional reform on the table to tweak, redraft, undo the spending cap. So whether it's a tweak to the spending cap or you implement a new rule, but I do think that that the first year will be characterized by altering the spending rule to accommodate more spending, particularly on social policy and investments, but with an eye and a care that this does not lead to a spiraling debt dynamic. And what that will probably come accompanied with is a tax reform. Part of it is a productivity reform to unify federal, state, and local taxes, but part of it with an eye to increase taxes to accommodate the more spending. Let's not forget that this is a candidate and a president who will try to tackle some of these social issues. There are pent-up demands on spending. Not only will the PT government want to increase spending on social policy, investments, public sector wages have been depressed on a real basis with inflation, with not adjusting the real wages. We saw the data from Carlos da Costa. There will be significant pressure adjustments on the public sector servants, and there will be pressure to increase the national minimum wage above inflation. I think the Lula will be able to hold, let's say, some of those in check, but it is a building up of the spending pressures. My bigger concern for Lula is year 2, year 3, okay? Because the bad news for a Lula government is I do think he will have a very tough road ahead. This is a deeply divided country. It's a highly polarized environment. We are in an environment across Latin America where the levels of disenchantment remain significant coming out of the pandemic. I deeply disagree with the view that we're returning to politics back to normal and that 2018 was an outlier of choosing candidates who are from the outside. We're seeing the levels of distrust remains very significant in Brazil. And I think that Congress will reflect that. I think that we will have kind of the left growing, and we will have a Bolsonaro cohort that will remain in Congress. And the Bolsonarista movement will not go away quickly. I think that will be a hurdle and an Achilles heel for a Lula administration.
Sure, Paulo. Thank you all for joining. Let me make 3 points here. One on growth. It's important not to forget that Brazil and Latam, many other EM, are essentially cyclical economies. And we've been through, and I think we'll continue, a very strong cycle. And very little of that cycle has been monetized, so to speak, in growth. So we've seen a substantial wealth transfer to Brazil. We've seen, actually as a byproduct and on the back of precaution as well, a very substantial increase in savings. And lots of mishandling of policies, of course, and politics, and has an uncertainty that has been strong headwind to growth. But the truth of the matter, historically, take it maybe 500 years if you want, it is a cyclical economy. And what we are discussing here on growth is how much of that will be wasted, right? How many times do we reinvent the wheel, try to reinvent the wheel going forward, and whether it's going to be square or triangle or maybe better like pentagon or octagon, I don't know. But the question here is that how much of that will be squandered, because the winds are strong. I think there are tailwinds. It's not very hard for Brazil to grow higher than 1% and going, well, potential is one. So there is spare capacity, etc. So there's one thing that I want to make, a consideration I want to make on growth, that I think the bar is quite low. It's very premature to commit to any low level at this point. Of course, we have global recession, stagflation can be a lot worse. Let's leave that aside. Brazil is complicated enough. Let's just focus on Brazil. I think Brazil has benefited a lot from the cycle, but has not really seen growth because a lot of that has been saved and not invested for good reasons. So I think that bar is quite low for Brazil to grow faster in the years to come.
We also expect the BRL not to remain in these levels until the end of the year. We expect some weakening, especially because of the start of the electoral cycle. As we're going to have more open debates, more news, especially moving from Brazil and abroad, more pressure for the candidates to actually be more specific on their economic agendas. We believe that this is going to bring about more uncertainty and more volatility to the market.
The question for me is, there is an element of maybe more policy continuity if we have a second administration of the same direction, if you will, or at least what you're getting in terms of the relationship, I would say, between Congress and the president. And I would like to say that the reforms were approved sometimes not because of the administration necessarily, but because of the support that this has in Congress, and many of these reforms and measures were actually kind of came out of Congress. So it's more than only the administration pushing. So I would see maybe a more or less if you can call this harmonious, right, or a more confrontational relationship between a Lula administration and a current Congress and its current composition, or even more, if you will, polarized. So that makes doing anything difficult. And at the same time, it makes changing what's in place difficult, because why would a Congress give a president more room to spend unless they are of the same direction somehow? So I think it's very complicated in that area to see massive changes, right? But I would say this, I think in a Lula administration, there will be more uncertainty around the policy direction that creates more noise, that creates more downside risk. So until the direction becomes clearer, it will be difficult for us to see, if you will, positive momentum, if that's what you're asking. Okay. So it's a very complicated scene, I would say.
Under Lula, he will give more to Congress on the distribution of ministerial appointments to party leaders in comparison to what Bolsonaro did. But he will take a harder line to try to be able to regain control over the congressional prerogatives, over the special amendments, right? RP9, which is a way to be able to control budgetary amendments, because this is a government that will want to spend more on investments or social policy, and they'll want to increase spending without having to increase taxes. So they'll fight the centrist parties in Congress. They'll construct a congressional majority, and I do think there's room to be able to have a tweak or alter the spending cap to accommodate some additional spending needs, because Congress also gains with more spending on investments as well, right? So there is a coalition to be had. Now, it's not going to be a meaningful unraveling, and it will be complemented with a tax reform, which is tough to get done. It's tough to approve taxes in Congress as well. So the end result, I think, will be a modest increase in spending and some revision of the tax reform. It'll put some constraints, but we shouldn't have too much faith that Congress will bar any changes to the spending cap, or even kind of, some changes to spending, which is important from a market point of view. When it comes to revisions of central bank independence, labor reform, all these other things, that's more difficult. I don't think that that's going to happen in any kind of meaningful way. This is a more conservative Congress. I don't see that. For spending, I don't think it's the same level of constraint. For Bolsonaro, he won't give as much on pork, but he gives more on control of the budget. And this will be a government that will push harder on privatizations. I think Bolsonaro will probably put the privatization of Petrobras up. I'm hearing this from ministers in the presidential palace, and Guedes will follow through on his idea of getting proceeds from privatizations to transfer more money to social policy outside the spending cap, but also half of that going to paying back debt. Ultimately, I think that if we have a higher commodity cycle, Lula will direct that for more spending, and Bolsonaro not as much, right? I think that it will be a lower tax burden, less spending equilibrium with more privatizations. in a little higher spending. But
No, I just want to reiterate my thanks, and I thought we learned a lot. So thank you very much. And